Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our program that we have dubbed Celebrate Jubilee. This is a Jubilee year, as we all know, and as Pope Francis dedicated this year as the Year of Hope. Back this past year, this past summer and this past fall, when we did the visioning sessions for our strategic plan, one of the reoccurring suggestions from community members was that we need to do more social things. We need to do more community events. Now, I think a lot of those people that suggested that had in mind parties. And that's certainly a community event. But we also realize that we need to do more events for the community that are chances for the faith community to come together and to journey together in our faith. And so a few months ago, when we started talking about what are we going to do for this upcoming Jubilee year, we threw around a bunch of ideas, and the idea that kind of stuck to the wall was this notion of, well, what is Jubilee in the first place? Where does it come from? And what does it mean today? And so in our planning, our church staff, we call ourselves Huddle. We meet twice a month. All the staff members who work on the church side of the FRC, we came up with this plan of finding two speakers, one who could tell us about the biblical roots of Jubilee, and another speaker who can tell us about the ramifications of it today, how it fits in with our current Catholic thought and Catholic theology. So we searched, and boy, did we find two good ones. We found Sister Dianne Bergant, who's a biblical scholar, to do the first part of our section today, and then we found Dr. Massimo Faggioli, who is going to take the more theological approach to Jubilee. Our agenda today, do we have, yep. Oh, look at that, perfect. So our agenda today is simply, I'll start with an opening prayer. Sister Dianne will do the first part. She'll speak for about an hour-ish this morning about the biblical roots of Jubilee. And then we'll take a short break, a 15-minute break, and then we will introduce Dr. Massimo Faggioli to speak about the ramifications, the meanings of Jubilee today and how we can celebrate it as faith communities today. And then we're going to see where the time is. Depending on where the time is, we will either go right into questions and answers, or if we're getting closer to 12 o'clock, we'll go to lunch, and then we'll do the Q&A after lunch. So we'll just see where we are once both presentations are done. We've given ourselves a little bit of flexibility just to see how things go. Lunch will be in the dining hall, so those of you who paid for lunch are welcome to go on over there. And at 12 o'clock is when that opens, and then we will be back here at 1 o'clock for Q&A if we didn't have the opportunity to do that before. Sound good? That's pretty much what we're going to do this morning. So if we could, I'd like to begin with an opening prayer. I'm going to invite you, as always, whenever we enter into prayer, to be conscious, be aware of God's presence. The presence of God is always with us, and it's up to us to bring ourselves to that awareness. So take a moment to be aware of God's presence. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus, risen Lord, source of our hope, your Spirit has guided the church in wisdom, and today has guided us to celebrate Jubilee. Even now, as we mourn the loss of our shepherd, Pope Francis, we recognize the necessity for a year of hope and the call to be instruments of hope for the world. This weekend at our Eucharist, we will hear and reflect on the gospel story of Thomas refusing to believe in your resurrection. Who could blame him, Lord? For we are told that the other disciples gave him no reason to believe, as they cowered behind a locked door. They were not acting like people of hope. May it not be so with us. As we journey on through this Jubilee year, may this community and the whole church be convincing to others that hope is alive. May today's program enlighten us about Jubilee, but more importantly, may it cultivate within us a deeper sense of how to be Easter people. May we look to the example of Pope Francis, who, like his namesake, lived a life of opening doors, not hiding behind locked ones. May our ongoing celebration of Jubilee make the Franciscan Renewal Center, Our Lady of the Angels Church, and each and one of us signs of hope. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so I get the honor of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Dianne Bergant, who is a sister of St. Agnes of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And she served on the faculty of the Catholic Theological Union from 1978 to 2023. She served as president of the Catholic Biblical Association of America and as the Reverend Robert J. Randall Distinguished Professor of Christian Culture at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. She was awarded honorary doctorates from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara, Marian University, Fond du Lac, and the Catholic University of Australia in Melbourne. She was an active member of the Chicago Catholic Jewish Scholars Dialogue, a member of the Board of Trustees at Sacred Heart School of Theology and the St. Francis Seminary in Milwaukee. She sat on the editorial boards of Bible Today, Biblical Theology Bulletin, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, New Theology Review, Teaching Theology and Religion, and Chicago Studies. She's taught and lectured in various places in the United States, as well in other parts of the world. Anecdotally, what I've discovered about Sister Dianne is that she has some pretty interesting former students. One of them happens to be a cardinal who is on the short list for possible new pope. That's Cardinal Prevost was one of her former students. Also among her former students was Chris Meyer, who is back there, and a young, spry, curious priest named Father Page Polk. Now, interestingly enough, Sister Dianne told me that she has kept every grade sheet from every class she's ever had. So it's going to be interesting to see if she can go home and find a few grades that we're all interested in knowing about. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sister Dianne to come on up and present our first topic.
All right, good morning. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm going to talk about, it's called the Biblical Roots, but as I go through the material, it's going to be material from the scriptures, from the Old Testament. I'm an Old Testament scholar. But as I go through it, you're going to ask yourself the question, perhaps, how is that connected with the Jubilee as we understand it today? And I'll leave it up to you to decide whether it is connected. What I want to talk about is based in three concepts. The fundamental concept is Sabbath. So I want to show you how the notion of Sabbath moves from Sabbath day to Sabbath year to Jubilee Year. So Jubilee is situated right within the context of Sabbath theology. Now we go into Genesis 1 to find out Sabbath, what the biblical text tells us about Sabbath. I hope you remember or you understand that although the Bible is narrative in most of its form, not all of its form, but most of the Bible is narrative. And many people have a tendency of presuming that it's historical. And it's not the same. Narrative is not necessarily historical. Myth is narrative, and it's not historical. And myth is not simply a four-letter word. Myth is a kind of story that describes or speaks about something that is too big and too deep for history. So is it true? Of course it is true. But it's not historical. So you got to open up your understanding of story a little bit broader than history. I say that because what I'm going to talk about is fundamentally myth. It's a story about something that is profound. Now, we are all old enough to be able to say that much in our life has been profound, but you can't describe it. Take, for instance, love, human love. Whether that be a love for a parent, a love of a parent, a love of partners. How do you describe love? You know it when you see it. You know it when you experience it, but you can't describe it. And we even say, I don't have any words to describe it. A child is born. You look at a newborn, they're beautiful. Well, not all of them are. But of course they are. On a profound level, they're beautiful. And how do you describe a beautiful newborn? There are no words. All right? So the words, we do the best we can. And that's what we do in theology, the best we can. But we're talking about mystery. We're talking about the all-holy God. We are talking about our participation in the universe. We are talking about our relationship with each other. It's too broad, too deep for history. And I say that realizing the next speaker is an historian. All right, that's just background, so you'll know where I'm coming from, as they say. We go into Genesis 1. It's in Genesis 1. There are 3 places that I'm going to talk about in talking about Sabbath. And we all know Sabbath. At least we know that Sunday is Sabbath. We may not remember observing it. I remember as a child, you always wear good clothes on Sunday. I may not have known why, because it was Sunday. But you always wore good clothes. When I was a young nun, I taught in a place in Wisconsin that had a store very much like Walmart. It was called Kopp's. And Kopp's was never open on Sunday. Well, they started to open it on Sunday, and the bishop was part of the argument of keeping it closed, because you don't work on Sunday. Why not? Yeah, but why do you not work on the Sabbath? What's the thing with the Sabbath? That's what we're talking about when we talk about Sabbath. So we find in Genesis chapter 2, on the 7th day, God finished work that he had done. Unfortunately, some people tell children the reason God didn't work on Sunday was because he was tired. That's fine for children, but many people don't grow out of that. They actually think that that's the case. And that's because it's not good teaching to teach adults that way. So I take responsibility as a teacher, making sure that my students do not cling to that. It's beautiful. If they want to say it's myth, well, then I'll ask them to describe what you mean. But, God rested, but why? Not because God was tired. Now, having said that, I have no evidence that God wasn't tired. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. So there's a relationship now we can see from this text between work and creation and Sabbath. That's the first part. But there are two places, two versions of the same story. Two places, one in Exodus, and the other one in Deuteronomy, where it talks about the commandments. And it explains what Sabbath is. This is Exodus. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord, your God. You shall not do any work. So once again, the question is, why don't we work? Why should we not work in the Sabbath? It goes on. You, your son, and your daughter. There's a listing of people who are not to work because the head of the household, now here if you know a little bit of the ancient world, the structure of the society, the head of the household, of course, not all societies, but ancient Israelite society was patriarchal. Arche means head, it's Greek for head. So the head of the household was a man. All right, but it's frequently the man didn't work, but his children did. All right, and the children didn't work, but the slaves did, and the slaves didn't work, but the animals did. And that's what we read here. Remember the 6 days. On the seventh is the Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not do any work. You, your son, and your daughter, your male and female slaves, your livestock. Animals work. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and consecrated it. If you read the story about the giving of the 10 commandments, there are very few of the commandments that have that long explanation. What you have is you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. So Sabbath needs a long explanation. We don't know whether that's because they didn't know what that meant, what the rest meant, because ancient Israel, in much of its religious history, really borrowed from its neighbors, borrowed from Egypt. Egypt was one of the neighbors of ancient Israel. Now we know the map of the ancient, I talk with my hands. I have to explain something. What we have is Egypt would be down here. Egypt is down here, I'm sorry, as you look at me. Egypt is south of Israel. And this is all desert. And then what you've got is a strip of land that's relatively fertile, and it's called the Fertile Crescent. And on the other end of the Fertile Crescent is Mesopotamia, which simply means land between two waters. And the waters are the Tigris and the Euphrates, which we all know about now because we know where Iraq is, and we know where Iran is. Not Iraq, I'm sorry. We know where Iran is. And Palestine is right in the middle. So that means as all superpowers try to extend its strength, watch television, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Superpowers are always flexing their muscle and try to get smaller nations under them. And what the smaller nation in Palestine would be Canaan, ultimately it would be Israel. So Egypt pushes its power up the Fertile Crescent until it meets Mesopotamia, which would be the Babylonians, the Syrians, the Assyrians, pushing itself down. So it's this kind of constant pressure of the minor nations, Israel being one of them. Now, all of this will take on a little bit more understanding in just a moment. But I say that because what Israel did was something else. Probably the core of Israel did not come from Egypt. A group came from Egypt, otherwise they wouldn't have a story. probably the core were people who were already living in Canaan. Far enough from Egypt, far enough from Mesopotamia, who were having internal problems, that they could live their own lives and not be constantly under threat. These people are constantly under threat. Israel was constantly under threat. All right? So these people then were able to live moderate lives, and then a group came out of Egypt. And when people celebrate, we tell stories. Everybody has had the experience. You go home and the family is celebrating Thanksgiving, and we tell stories about what it was like when we were kids, and our siblings will tell us, you're wrong, that didn't happen. Because it's a different point of view. I mean, there's not just one story. There are as many stories or more stories than there are people sometimes. Some people have more than one story. But they keep the stories because fundamentally they talk about the family getting together, or they talk about the people getting together, and they learn from other nations and get stories from other nations and then speak about their experience using the language of other nations. And we do that all the time. We just don't always know that we do that, but we do that all the time. So what we have now, and remember what we're talking about, Sabbath. All right, but what we have now is they're told to rest because God rested. And I remember I raised the question, what's the connection between God's rest and Sabbath? Let's just take those two, God's rest and Sabbath. And then the other one was creation, which is very important. What happened at creation? And the answer to that is, which story? Because nobody was there. Nobody saw what happened. So where did the story come from? It came from other people's story about creation. But evidently there's some relationship, and that's what we want to talk about, or that I want to underscore, because we're talking about Jubilee. I would suggest we move away from this story of creation and go to the Genesis 1 story of creation, where God created man and woman in God's image and said, increase and multiply and fill the earth, which God said to the plants and the animals as well. Increase and multiply, fill the earth, fill the sky, fill the waters. So that's nothing different. But subdue and have dominion. Okay, image of God, subdue and have dominion. What is an image of God? And don't say soul, please. I realize that has been very much a part of our tradition, but that's a Greek word, and you're not going to find a Greek word in an ancient Hebrew story. Now, someplace in our history, it took on meaning as soul, and that's a beautiful time in our history, and that's wonderful theology, but that's not in the first story of creation. So what is an image of God? And chances are you all have heard about an image of God. It's the golden calf. That is an image of God. We give images to things. If you wear jewelry, why do you wear jewelry? Just to decorate yourself? And if there's something given to you by somebody who's very close to you, that's an image, that's a symbol of something. So we know, we live them. We live, lives are filled with images. Flags are images. Flags are a symbol. Flags, and that's an excellent, I think, example of what an image is. Flags represent the jurisdiction of the country. Because where a flag is, you better respect that country. We fight wars when our flags are not respected. Not because of the cloth, not because of the design, but for what it stands for. It is an image of the jurisdiction of a nation. Paul uses the word ambassador. What is an ambassador? A person who stands for the nation in another country. That person does not stand for his or her own thinking. That person stands for the thinking of the government, of the nation. And if they don't stand for that, they call them home. That's imagistic kind of thinking. So the image of God stands for something about God, not about us. Stands for something about God, at least in this one interpretation. And again, I want to say, I'm not saying others are wrong. I'm saying that's not what's really in the story. So the image of God stands for something about God. What about God does the image stand for? Not increase and multiply and fill the earth, but subdue and have dominion. Okay, subdue and have dominion. Now, the Hebrew word for subdue is a very harsh word. Sometimes it is translated rape. So it's an extraordinarily harsh word. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean rape in this story, but it's still harsh. Have dominion is not a harsh word. You can soften that word, but you can't soften subdue. That's a hard one. So I want to just put it aside. Shows the limitation of biblical interpretation or reinterpretation. But dominion means care for, be responsible for. Now, if that's what that means, the image of God, which the text says is you and me, we stand for God. We stand in the place of God. We are the flag of God. We are the ambassador of God. And how do we function? We have dominion over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea. That's what the text says. And everything that lives on the land. We didn't interpret this 10 years ago, 20 years ago probably. We did not interpret that idea of being image of God in the way we do today. And the way we do it today, it is wide open for ecological theology. 20 years ago, we didn't know ecological theology. But because science, our society, just like the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and Israel, taking from their society, from their time in history, and interpreting their understanding of God from that point of view. So today what we have done is taken a little bit of knowledge that we have about ecological issues, and we begin to interpret it, and we begin to realize that image of God in Genesis 1 is really, we are like a representative of God in the world. And my question is, are we? And that's a very serious question for us. It's serious theologically to say nothing about climate change and nothing about, but that's wide open. So the notion of image of God is not in any way a dead theme, something we have grown out of because society has changed. So we have image of God. Image of God. Okay, and that's a creation theme, and we're still getting back on Genesis 1, where we see God worked, but rested, and you've got the notion of image of God. Jump from Genesis 1 creation narrative over to Genesis 3, which is the story of the sin. What sin did those people, this is a mythic story, but it's a profound story. It's a deep theological story about you and me, not just Adam and Eve, about you and me. What sin did they commit? Don't say disobedience, because all sin is disobedience. But if you look deeply, what sin did they commit? The serpent said to the woman, "You shall be like God, knowing good from evil." In the ancient world, the major god always had control over life. If there was somebody who had control over life, somebody else who had control over life, then that major god was not a major god. There are two characteristics that major god always had to have, and they were always fighting to keep them. Now, one of them is power over life and death, and the other one is knowledge. If you had a God smarter than your God, then your God's not a major God. Notice two of these characteristics: power over life and knowledge. That should make you think of two trees: the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. You can have one, but you can't have the other. Because if you have the other, then you're a major God. And what sin did they commit? God said, you can have the tree of life, live life. But they wanted the tree of knowledge as well. They wanted to be gods. That's the major sin. That is hubris. And that is the sin we're all guilty of. We want our will. And we want to do what we want to do the way we want to do it. And by God, they're going to know that I'm in charge. I remember as a kid, there was a phrase, "Who died and left you, boss?" That's what we're talking about. Which means that is our desire. And original means not first necessarily, not in this story, I don't think. Deep and fundamental. That's what original means. So now we go back, the Jubilee day, or Sabbath day. We are to rest. And again, because God worked for 6 days, and then God rested. God who made creation. We didn't make it, and so we should not act as if we did. We should not think that we are the creators of the world. So there's one day set apart, even though there's work to be done, to remind us that we are not God. We are not gods in the worst sense of this word. I mean, I know in New Testament you shall be like gods, but that's not what, that's another understanding. There's something that would be something divine, that's the promise. But this is, I'm in charge of the world. That's the hubris. So how do we enact, how do we demonstrate this theology on Sunday? How do you? Again, when I was a young nun, we were not allowed to check papers on Sunday. For that sense, Sunday was a burden sometimes. I mean, think about your own lives. But the issue is, do we even make Sunday a special day? And it's special because we remind ourselves, not God, we remind ourselves, you are the creator, you are the one in charge. And by your grace, by the grace of God, I function in this world as your representative. That's what Sunday rest means. And I throw it out to you and to me as well. Is that how we live it? That's the day of Jubilee. When we look at Jubilee Year, it's a little different. It's there, but it's a little bit different. This is in, I was working with Genesis and Exodus. This is in Deuteronomy. Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts. Forgive debts. This is really a good one. And this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exactly exacting it of the neighbor who is to be a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of the community owes you. There's a forgiveness of debt. Now, why is that? Well, if you think about, again, Israel was, at the time of David, maybe about 40 years, they say a lifetime, rounding it up. King David was able to consolidate small nations only because both Mesopotamia and Egypt were having internal problems. And as soon as he began to consolidate, his nation got bigger, which means that they were apt to join him because he was bigger, and that would make him bigger. All right? So that's one time. And that's a time when there was peace in Israel. No threat from Egypt or Mesopotamia or any other nations up in the north or whatever. But these are two major ones. Then from 167 to about 163 before the Common Era, the time of the Maccabean revolt, 3 years Israel was at peace. So now we've got 43 years. In how many generations that Israel was thriving without any threat of the other nations? Israel was usually under somebody else's thumb. That's why most of the Psalms are laments. Most of the Psalms are not songs of praise, they're laments. Deliver us from what? From taxes, from oppression. And the way we know this for sure at the time of Jesus, and it was not much different than that earlier, but for sure at the time of Jesus, they were part of the empire, Greco-Roman Empire. So you had to pay taxes to the emperor. But they lived in Israel, which was a nation, a kingdom. It had a king. Herod was a king. They lived under a king, so you had to pay taxes to the king as well. But you didn't live necessarily in Jerusalem. You lived in a little burg called Galilee. So there would be like a governor, and you had to pay taxes there. So you got the government taxes, you got the empire taxes, you got the kingdom taxes, you got the local government taxes, and then you got the tax collector. They were not salaried. So how did they live? They took a percentage from everybody else. So where does that leave the average person? In debt. Always in debt. And in many societies, for sure in the ancient Near Eastern world, when you could not pay your debts, they threw you in prison. I remember as a kid, I never figured out why put them in prison, because then they can't work and pay your money back. And the answer to that is a goel, a redeemer. Now for us, we think redeeming is that Jesus redeemed us from our sins. Some of us are old enough to remember green stamps. And we would redeem green stamps. That's the language that we use. To redeem means somebody's in jail and you pay the bond. That's what redemption is. Somebody else pays the bond. It's financial. That's financial language. Not just religious. It's financial language. Okay, so on the seventh year, you got to forgive all your debts. Who is looking forward toward Jubilee Year? The poor, the people who are in debt, not the rich. And so as we get closer to the seventh year, people who are owed money are trying desperately to get their money, because on the seventh year, it's all clean. Now, is that fair? Well, what does fair mean? You got to remember, we do not have, I don't think, we don't have tribal mentality in the same way as the ancient did. We're much more individualistic. And our tribe is usually those who are the closest to us in blood. Marriage in blood. Well, that was the case in Israel as well. But they were much more tribal. And individual property, it was the tribe's property. The reason, that women were forbidden to do certain things and were more guarded was because women are the ones who carried within their bodies the potential of the future. The family jewels belong to the women because their body contains the promise of life. And the life is not, ours is very different, all right? And I'm not pushing, that we go back to theirs. But the potential of the future did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the entire tribe. And so they made sure, she was watched, not because she could not be trusted, but because other men could not be trusted. Because if there was adultery, the woman was responsible because she carried, the possibility of life. Men were not always considered guilty of adultery. Of theft, yes, because they stole the possibility of life. And so if a man was found guilty, he was guilty of theft, not so much adultery in the same way as women. Right? Now, I'm saying that because everything was held in common, like a family. Like a family. I doubt whether, in your family, people have to ask. People in the family have to ask, can I have a piece of bread? Because it's there. It's for us. And the most delicate and vulnerable are asked to do almost nothing because they're delicate and vulnerable, whether they're old or they're too young, or they're ill or whatever. We don't ask family members to pay. I had to sit up with you all night long, and I missed my television program. Besides that, you owe me. We don't talk like that. That's sort of a kind of mentality that tribal people have. And in fact, many nations, even today, when they ask, us, when somebody asks us, who are you? Frequently, we tell them in answer to that question what we do. Many people don't tell them what they do. They tell them where they come from. I belong to this tribe, and on my mother's side, I'm this tribe. So they identify themselves as the members of the group. That's still very prominent in some societies in the world today. Very prominent in ancient Israel. So keep that in mind when you realize that there's a tribal mentality. Today we talk about tribal mentality and accuse somebody of being tribal. It's an insult, unless, of course, they're really a tribe, belonging to a tribe. So what we have now is this whole idea of the seventh year. We find the seventh year, the Sabbath year, we find mention of it in Deuteronomy. We find that mention of it in Leviticus as well. So we got the Jubilee, or the Sabbath day, and with creation. And we have the seventh year with what? With justice. We've moved a little bit away from the idea of creation, but we're talking about the things of the earth. The things of the earth. Money, and it was not always money. It was cattle, it was grain. The monetary or the paying was frequently one for another and not always money involved. Now that brings us finally to Jubilee Year. And Jubilee Year we find in Leviticus. You find it in other places as well, but we find in Leviticus. Let me find it here, 25. Okay. You shall count off 7 weeks of years. 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Now, in some places, it sounds like the Jubilee year is the 49th year. And other places, it sounds like the Jubilee year is the 50th year. And that might represent different times of celebration at different times in Israel's history. More than that, I don't think we have to worry, but just understand sometimes it's 49 and sometimes it's called 50. You shall hallow the 50th year, there it is, this one, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. To all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return everyone to your property. Now here's where it's more than debts. It's property. Again, not all farms are profitable because not all farms have the same valued land. Some land is better in some parts of the country than in other part of the country. And again, think this is monetary. This is financial issues. That if someone goes into debt, frequently they have to sell their land. Ideally, you sell it within the tribe. Because chances are, in this 50 years, that would be considered a period that is bounded by 2 Jubilee years. In this 50 years, if you are in debt to a member of your tribe, it's much better than being in debt to somebody who's not a member of your tribe. They may let you work on it. We have the story of Ruth, where in harvesting, they didn't harvest boundary to boundary. They left a part of the land. Let's say it was wheat. They would leave a part of the wheat so that the poor could come in and could harvest that for themselves. They had different ways of making sure that they cared for each other. What we find in Jubilee has to do with land. And the land shall rest. The land was supposed to rest during the Jubilee year. During the Sabbath year. The land rested. Let me go back one step. I forgot to say that. One thing that the land had to do was the Sabbath of the land. The land rested, which means for one whole year you did not work the land. Now that might sound like good governing of agricultural practice. Allow the land to lie fallow. But when we allow land to lie fallow, we cultivate other land. All right, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about you allow the land to lie fallow. Think of the challenge of that. If you leave the land to lie fallow, what are you going to eat the next year? So that means that the last year, you got to harvest enough to last you for 2 years. For the 1 year when you don't harvest, and the next year that you would have eaten the land, the grain of the land that you didn't plant. All right? Then you're risking, you may not even have a good year. All right? And again, why? You allow the land to lie fallow. The land rests as well as people resting. We've seen why the human beings are supposed to rest. Because the rest, we are saying to God, I am a servant. I am a flag. I am a representative of God. I did not create the world, and I should not think that it should be run by me according to my laws. So it's a recognition. Creation, recognizing creation in this way is a way of saying to God, you are God, and I worship you, and I expect worship from no one else. When we get to the Jubilee or the Sabbath year, the land rests. So it's getting very specific about the land belonging to God, not Israel. When Israel came into the land, Israel fought its way into the land. There were people living. It was not an empty space that said welcome. They fought it. And there are stories in Joshua and Judges. But the stories are told from Israel's point of view. And you can be sure that Israel will tell it from their point of view. One thing about the Bible stories, Israel never presents itself as perfect. In the biblical stories, in the Old Testament stories, it is always God who is the winner. God who is in the right, not Israel. That's very different from other ancient Near Eastern societies. They had heroes that became God. Israel never tried that. Because if they would have tried that, there would have been someone to put them down. And if they did try it, those stories did not last. Stories about how we do not deserve this, but God cares for us. That's a unique understanding of an ancient God, which Yahweh was. An ancient Near Eastern concept of God. Where Israel ever got it, I think that's a question of faith. It's a question of faith. So the land then is God's land. And to show that we acknowledge it, we are not necessary for the fertility of the land. Just like we are not, we are not the gods ruling. We are not necessary, for the fertility of the land. Those stories are told by farmers. They're not told by maritime people. They're told by farmers. They know what they're talking about. They know how important good farming is. good land management is, and they acknowledge it is nothing compared to God's. So that's what the Sabbath year is about. So the land rests. And again, if the land rests, that means I rest, we rest from harvesting. And we don't rest and have our kids do it, so your sons and your daughters. And they don't rest and have the slaves do it. And they don't rest and have the animals do it. Nobody does it. And that's our way of showing we are totally dependent on God, and it's God's land, not ours. That's very strong in the Old Testament as well. The land of Israel does not belong to the Israelites. It belongs to God. Well, that tells us we're very far from that in this day and age. Then we go to the Jubilee. And what we have is what I was reading. What you find is remitting all debts. The Jubilee really brings all of these together. Once in a lifetime, 50 years. That's considered, in round numbers, that's a lifetime. Once in a lifetime. Also, I think it also demonstrates that no person should be born into such poverty that they can't get out of it. Because once in a lifetime, maybe one time when we were 7, all right? Or maybe another time when we were 27, however it was. But people do not inherit poverty if you have a Jubilee year. Imagine what would happen to our economic system if every 50 years all debts were forgiven. Well, there are some nations that can't, they've never been able to pay their debts. There are nations, and don't we scalp them? Right? So, Jubilee then, again, both, and I call it Jubilee or I call it Sabbath. The Sabbath, 50 years is the Jubilee, but it's the same, it's just a different name for the same reality. Whether it is the day or the year or the generation. They speak about God's omnipotence, not ours, God's omnipotence. But they also say how important we are. As image of God, again, I think that that's an examination of conscience for all of us. How do I manifest God to the world? The goodness, the generosity, the care, the forgiveness. How do we forgive debts? Do we forgive debts as individuals or as a nation? How do we do this? And that's what we find in Jubilee theology. How do we allow the land, not just as good farmers, but allow the land to lie fallow and acknowledge that God will care for us? It's interesting how frequently you find people who have almost nothing, constantly say God will take care of us. It's not the people, who have so much. Not the people who work and work and work and work and work because they want to be in charge. And we got a lot of that on television as well. And then, as I say, that a whole generation benefits from the goodness of the generation. So when we talk about Jubilee, now I speak as somebody, we celebrate Jubilee, my congregation, as all congregations, celebrate Jubilee every single year. Not the same person, of course, but we celebrate. There's always somebody, who's been in the congregation for 15 years. This year we got somebody 75. One time we had somebody who was 109 years. In the community, 109 years. My novice directress, she was 109 years in the community. And sharp as a tack, all right? And we celebrate them, but we don't give land away, we don't forgive debts. We wear corsages. And it's important, to wear a corsage. But it's also important to realize it's not what I have done. And when you celebrate jubilees or call them anniversaries, what are you celebrating? How wonderful you are, singular, or how wonderful the other one is? Or what you have done in the world. The same thing with us. I facetiously say sometimes, what have they done if they've been here for 50 years? What big thing have they done? And the answer is they've stayed. That's it. But it means something much deeper than that. It means that we are sustained. Not we sustain ourselves, we are sustained. Do we trust that? So I think as far from our society as Sabbath day or Sabbath year or Jubilee year, as far from our society as that thinking is, there's a profound challenge if we understand the theology, a challenge that really speaks to us. How do we even know about it? And if we do, how do we celebrate it? That, I think, is the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Dianne. So we're going to take about a 15-minute break. We'll have snacks in the hospitality area. If you guys don't know where that is, it's right in front of the bookstore. You go through those set of doors right there. Make a little left. Thank you. A little early morning for me. Left, and then another left down the breezeway, and you'll see these two set of tables. We have ice water, soft drinks, as well as little pickings, snacks that you can have if you didn't have breakfast this morning. I just want to remind you all that if you're going to grab any beverages or snacks, to please consume them before entering the auditorium, because food and drinks aren't allowed here in the auditorium. So we will reconvene at 10:15, and just hang tight, and we'll have Massimo come on afterwards. Thank you.